The city of Eugene may have a long, rich history when it comes to activism and protest, but hit the streets today looking for anything outside a war protest, and you'll find things are very quiet.
Too quiet.
I think today it's considerably different than what it was, let's say, when I started getting involved, which is about 95.
I do feel like it's changed. I feel like there's lots of changes that have gone on. You know, before there was a lot of frustration in the community.
Things have dramatically changed in the way that people sort of push for change within the Eugene area or the county or even the state, probably even over, the whole country.
From tree protests to forest blockades to anarchy riots, the 7-year period from 1995 to 2001 was as active as anyone has ever seen in Eugene and the surrounding areas. But something changed, and for many, it started with how EPD began treating the protesters they were clashing with in the streets.
Men with shotguns in full SWAT uniforms on the streets.
They just made it harder. They cracked down on the tree sitters and so forth. It got more dangerous.
The Eugene Police Department has a clear history of excessive use of force, and that certainly has altered the way people conduct themselves.
I feel like there's one incident after another in this community that continues to make the people feel unsafe.
And EPD wasn't alone in the crackdown. Eugene's role in the WTO seemed to not only bring newfound attention from the rest of the country, but from outside law enforcement agencies as well.
I think here in Eugene, part of it was what happened after Seattle, the anti-WTO stuff at the end of 1999. There were, if I remember this correctly, 15 different governmental agencies working here.
It wasn't just the response on the streets that had changed either. It was the sentences being handed down in the courts that seemed to really be sending the message.
I think what's different about Jeffrey Luers is that the reaction to that by the system was pretty extreme.
Jeff Luers, charged with firebombing the Romania SUV car lot in 1999, was sentenced to close to 23 years in prison.
Everybody I know who's heard of this story is shocked by the sentence he got. Not to say anything about arson. I mean, arson is horrible and it should not be condoned. But to put somebody away for 2 decades for something that doesn't involve any injury to human beings or animals, I think people had a pretty strong reaction to that.
And Luers was just the first. The search was still on for the people responsible for a rash of arsons across Oregon and the Northwest, many tied to the Animal and Earth Liberation Front movements. The FBI eventually caught up with them, but in the post-9/11 world, their acts were not being looked at as just simple arsons. The people behind them not looked at as just simple activists.
When the Attorney General comes on TV and gives this full-out scare thing.
Terrorism is terrorism, no matter what the motive.
No, I think if somebody's willing to set fire to something, they know that they're going to face some pretty serious consequences if they get caught.
What many of the conspirators didn't know was the fires they were starting would be considered acts of terrorism. In what the U.S. government dubbed as Operation Backfire, 11 environmental activists were arrested and labeled domestic terrorists.
And I think if you're gonna, do those kind of things, I think you gotta be ready to play that out all the way for the rest of your life. And I don't think the people that did that were quite ready. And then the feds came in and knocked on their doors. And they were talking. They were ready to reveal information about each other because there wasn't a community of support in existence anymore.
The message seemed clear. Criminal acts of protest were not being taken lightly, and the shift would set off a trickle-down effect.
Certainly the police and government have used those rare instances as an excuse to treat lawful protesters unconstitutionally.
People talk about 9/11, that just kind of crushed all dissent, and people wanted to stay quiet and not attract the attention of the authorities.
No one wants to end up on a terrorist watch list, and no one really wants their privacy violated.
The Eugene protest scene today may seem much quieter, but the perception of how police handle the rare instances of civil unrest has not changed much.
I think the Ian Van Ornum incident and the pesticide rally is kind of an example of that, where For one reason or the other, the response was completely overblown.
So now tasers, of course, are the big issue. They weren't back then, but doesn't feel like that the police department's being reined in at all. So yeah, people are more cautious about street protests. Certainly the pesticide incident, you know, went along with that and kind of reinforced that the police department still feels like they can do whatever they want.
Government agency reactions don't necessarily explain everything, though. Even though technology has the ability to connect a greater number of people, it may also have played a role in the disappearance of the protester.
I see a lot of people being more isolated, whereas before would be in, you know, taverns or wherever, sitting around and talking about what we might do, having a beer. Now everybody's in their cafes and on their laptops and isolated and emailing each other.
But it may be that, you know, the meeting place has become more virtual and we're not going out and watching people speak.
It can be a substitute for actual connections. That's the downside. Now we can instantly communicate, but you know, you have less face-to-face interaction.
Meanwhile, there also may be less to protest. Between Warner Creek and the Biscuit Fire protests, environmentalists have scored several major victories, both on the front lines and in court.
Well, I think it would be a combination of successes in the courtrooms, which are oftentimes preceded by direct frontline activism in the forest.
The Willamette no longer logs old growth, which was of course the most contentious type of logging that most people were concerned about.
Things did calm down a little bit because frankly, the environmental activists I know would prefer to go to court.
Police response, technology, past successes. None of it, though, means protest in Eugene is gone for good.
I certainly hope that if there are issues, if protest voices need to be heard, we would rise to the occasion.
I think that just comes and goes in waves, you know, that people are just going to get moved by something, they're going to get angry enough to go out in the streets and march.
There's a need for, I think, people to feel like at least they're pulling, you know, the jackboot off their head a little bit and fighting against it.
Tends to come in waves, and people fall back and regroup.
I think the anarchist alternative is getting more attention or more serious consideration, I would say. As things get worse, people are looking for alternative explanations or approaches.
And I think that that's what people are looking for too, is some sort of sense of friendship and community, and also at the same time challenging injustices, which, you know, what the hell, that's what Superman does, right?